The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Good evening and welcome to my State of Mind. I am Dan Yorke. The state of mind of the country is in flux, no doubt, after an election that was as controversial as one might have thought it could be times 10, capped off by the president's pronouncement last night that he believes he's won, an insinuation that the counting should stop, even though he said the voting should stop. PC Professor Joe Cammarano joins us. His political science expertise is warranted here. And forgive, because we taped this program earlier in the day, and you may see it more than once this week. Some of the counting may have changed some of the state dynamics towards the Electoral College, but some of the concepts are intact. So we appreciate your patience there. First, here's what the network was reporting at the deadline for the show this morning.
President Trump tried to declare victory overnight at the White House.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
CBS News has not projected a winner in the race for president, with a number of states still counting ballots, and neither candidate having the 270 electoral votes needed.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning.
President Trump said he's ready to go to court to challenge the results. The Biden campaign called the president's remarks a, quote, naked effort to take away the democratic rights of American citizens.
We believe we're on track to win this election.
Former Vice President Joe Biden addressed his supporters in Delaware just after midnight this morning.
We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it's going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient. And it ain't over till every vote is counted.
Because of the coronavirus pandemic, a record number of Americans voted early and by mail. It's taking longer to count those votes in states like Michigan, which hopes to have its results later today.
Be beyond tomorrow morning before we actually get the vote count.
And Pennsylvania, where it could be days before there's an official result.
What's most important is that we have accurate results and that every vote is counted.
CBS News projects the president held Biden off in Texas, Iowa, and Florida, while Biden held on to Minnesota. Georgia has yet to be called, partly because a water line break at State Farm Arena delayed counting absentee ballots.
And so our go-to guy at Providence College, political scientist Joe Cammarano, is with us. Full disclosure, Joe got more sleep than your host because what? You kind of knew what the president was going to say in the wee hours and you went to bed not stressed about it.
Yeah, basically I understood that state election rules in the battleground states, we're not going to pick a winner tonight or last night, and that it might be a few days, and that anything we hear from the White House is going to be wishful thinking rather than a description of what's happening. And so why lose sleep over that?
Well, you have more personal discipline than I do.
You haven't seen my apartment lately.
I stayed up watching, and I will tell you, when you watched it live, I had two thoughts that were running through my head. A, thank God this is 2:30 in the morning, simply because the number of people, at least on the East Coast and the Midwest, that probably had quit just like you. And B, I can't believe what I'm watching. I could believe it. The tweets that he sent gave us the indication of what he was going to say. What he's been saying for the last month about the election gave us an indication of what he was going to say. But that he actually came out there and you could feel him tempting fate. You could feel him just revving up to be able to say, I won the election. It was, I think, for anybody who just wants to see this country heal and just wants to see this country operate in the space of integrity that we count the elections to be in, it was horrifying. Horrifying.
It was, if you don't understand that what President Trump says is what he wishes to become. And so, I have long ago given up on the idea that President Trump is trying to be an honest disseminator of information. He's simply trying to create the reality that he desires. And so again, I wasn't surprised, and I knew that if I had watched it, I would stay up all night. And I had classes this morning, and so what matters is what's going on in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona, not what's happening in Washington right
now. Yeah, I understand that, and of course, and I'll keep repeating this as we start to talk about the play-by-play of this election. Joe and I are recording this in the mid-morning this morning. State results are probably going to be coming in sans Pennsylvania all the way through the day in the early evening. So some of what we're talking about may very well be obsolete, and we're probably going to end up chasing our tail a little bit on this TV show because of our production schedule over the course of the week. And we'll have to regroup on Monday. Let me ask you this, Joe. Do you think, I want to talk about the details as we experience them right now, but do you think we'll have a resolve by Monday, a pretty clear picture of where this is going to be?
I was thinking about this since last week. I said I think it's going to be settled within a couple days, and I still think that that's the case. Yes, there will be court challenges, as many as the Trump administration can. The Trump campaign. Wait, there's no difference. The Trump people decide they want done. So this will linger all the way through into December. But the reality is Pennsylvania, which is going to be the last reporter, is no longer the make or break for Biden, because it looks like he's going to win Arizona. So if he wins Arizona and Nevada and Wisconsin and Michigan, it's over. All of those states should have their pretty close to final numbers within the next 24 hours.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about, what we experienced just in general. We'll get to the play-by-play of the states again and repeat that, repeat what Joe just had to say and go through the details as we get it. Also got to talk about the Senate, because it seems like that's held for the Republicans. And we got to talk about Rhode Island for a little bit, because some interesting things happened there. What's phenomenal to me, and this is right in the alley of political science, and I'm sure something that you're going to be teaching a lot about, is the dichotomy between in-person voting yesterday and mail-in voting, and somewhere in the middle, I guess, is early voting. But the mail-in vote Democratic majority is consistent from one state to the next across this country, which is why, as we speak in the morning, we're still looking at some of that turnout stuff, certainly in Pennsylvania. But look what happened in Rhode Island last night. We waited for the three chunks of votes: the today vote, meaning election show-up vote, the early voting, and then the mail-in voting, all of which were about 1/3 each of the total composite. What's a political scientist say about the flavor of the mail-in voting versus the flavor of the in-person voting?
Yeah, I think there's something to say about the national and the state level. I think at the national level, I think it's a function of President Trump discouraging his supporters from going out, and having a much more traditional field organization of getting out the vote by knocking on doors over a long period of time. And so that more traditional thing is geared toward getting people out on election day. And that's what the Trump campaign did. And he did it very successfully, by the way. I want to make sure that people understand their organization was really well run on the ground. So I think it's a function of President Trump discouraging people from early voting, and I expect early voting to be much more bipartisan nationally. Rhode Island was really interesting because, I got fooled. I looked at the numbers and I looked precincts reporting, and it was 96%, and I thought Langevin had lost. And I'm like, I didn't even pay any attention to this campaign. But it turns out that, there was a bit of a glitch, and it was a glitch of misunderstanding on my part. But it was really fascinating that, that my guess is my breezing through the poll yesterday in East Providence was not the same as somebody voting in Foster or Gloucester. That it was probably fairly heavily attended. And so we did see a really distinct difference in Rhode Island that fascinates me. And I'm going to ask my colleague Adam Myers to study it.
Yeah, it is incredible. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the diminishment of the mail-in process by Donald Trump certainly caused his voters to come out live on election day. And I will tell you, the polling on COVID is reflective of that response. I mean, the lack of concern about the virus among.
I got to tell you something. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That I believe that the most serious problem for this country is manifested in those exit polling results that suggest that belief in COVID, belief in the severity of COVID, the significance of COVID is an ideological and partisan thing these days. That's an indicator of a country that's on the decline. The notion that science is driven by politics. To me, that was the scariest thing I saw last night. And and again, I apologize for those who are Trump supporters and don't believe COVID's a big deal. You're wrong. And we're going to suffer terribly, and we very well could lose our position if this becomes a dominant dynamic in American politics.
Our position meaning?
Our position in the world as an intellectual leader, as a place everybody wants to come and study and then stay and come up with patents and win Nobel Prizes. Most of our Nobel Prize winners are actually people who came to this country. And that's an important dynamic that we very well could lose if we lose the belief in science.
Well, all you had to do was watch the East Room at 2:30 in the morning and see people packed into it, nobody wearing a mask. I couldn't, it's like.
Well, I'm a little more understanding of that. I went back for my dad's funeral to New Jersey, and I stayed off on the side. But it became very obvious to me that there's a certain group dynamic that makes us forget the potential danger of touching each other, of not wearing a mask. And so I'm a little more sympathetic to that idea of a group dynamic that leads us to not think rationally. I'm more concerned about purposive misinformation aimed at using science as a weapon.
Okay. When we come back, we'll talk about what this mumbo jumbo of the states and the Electoral College mean, and we'll touch base on Rhode Island as well with PC Professor Joe Cammarano. Please stay with us. Welcome back to My State of Mind with PC Professor Joe Cammarano. All right, listen, again, there might be a level of obsoleteness to this conversation. We apologize for that. We're recording our program early in the day on the day after the election, and it's a fast-moving situation. The win that Joe Biden may just get in Arizona all of a sudden makes Pennsylvania less of a problem. And it seems like Wisconsin, by the way, polls that had Wisconsin for Joe Biden at 8, 9, 10, 11 points, those people ought to be fired, right? I mean, it's holy.
Well, yeah, I don't know if they should be fired, but I do think there's a fundamental problem now with the way that we gather that information. And, the Trafalgar Group guy who came up with this idea that there's a latent measure, that people have social desirability that leads them not to admit that they're going to vote for the person that they know evidently is not somebody they should vote for, but they're going to do it anyway. I think we need to find a way to measure that latency. This idea of the underlying attitudes that leads us to hide information, the way we hide family secrets.
Yeah, okay, well, methodologies aside, Wisconsin's holding for Joe Biden actually he made a little comeback from where you went to bed last night, where you woke up in the morning, as Milwaukee and Madison populations were counted. So it looks like he may hold on there. If he's able to get Michigan, and there's indications that he might, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan seem like the combo that gets him to 270. Nevada in there too. He's got
and Maine, which he's almost certainly going to win Maine.
Yeah, which could take this oh my gosh, wait till Friday thing in Pennsylvania out of the picture. You think that's kind of where we're going to be?
I think it probably is. And, Georgia's not out of the question because most of the uncounted ballots are in Fulton County, which is Atlanta.
Right.
And even North Carolina is not out of the picture. But, assume Trump is going to win those 2 southern states. It doesn't matter. And even Pennsylvania doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, the Atlanta thing is interesting. That, they were talking this morning about a water main break problem, blah blah blah, da da da. Whatever technical. I mean, that is right for Donald Trump to just say that's a manufactured problem. But
we could say it's Russian plumbers.
Yeah, geez. We got.
I'm going to remind you and everybody else. Remember, you don't have to take what Donald Trump says as any resemblance to what is. And again, there's a desire for it to be that way. That doesn't mean always to be skeptical, but listen.
Well, to that point, I was wondering too last night as the president was defying all history, really, and responsibility in the White House by declaring that he thought he was the winner. I was wondering how many Trump voters actually looked at that and went, "Oh my God!" I mean, it's one thing to vote for him. How much quotient from? I'm not even talking about the base, but people who voted for Donald Trump for reasons that they still think are legitimate, and we've got to respect that. If we don't respect that, then you and I are no better than anybody else, right?
I was thinking a lot about this last night. One of the things we've done is we've underestimated the value of being transactional as a form of leadership. That presidents are supposed to be transformational. They're supposed to inspire us. But Donald Trump is transactional. And what I think we have seen is that he outperforms the polls in part because people may not like him. They may be disgusted by him, and there's a different but for about 12 different groups. And so, but he's pro-life, but he's anti-regulation, but he's going to lower taxes, but he's going to, have law and order. That's a coalitional approach that is very much a modern concept that we've kind of abandoned. So, these people aren't voting for Donald Trump, they're voting for the policies. And that's not really a bad thing, actually.
Well,
I prefer that to the ones who do the hero worship with him.
Well, it's fascinating you say that because my email has been full, from radio and television listeners for months now trying. I've been on the record as saying that I think his comportment and the lack of presidentiality has now become so devastating to the country and the country's position in the world that roster of issues has become a secondary concern for me. But that may not be the calculation that others are making. And you speak right to what people have been trying to say.
And the other guy's gonna take stuff from me. That's the other side of that.
Right. The other guy is going to tax me. The other guy is going to make a socialist country. The other guy's got to blah, 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 and Kamala Harris,
The damage that will be done by the end of 8 years to a Trump administration will leave us bankrupt. It will leave us sort of maybe no longer on the first tier of world powers in terms of leader. We'll have a big army, but nobody will listen to us. But the reality is he gives people what they want. That's better than nothing.
By the way, it's Kamala Harris. So, we've stopped the prediction game, you and I, but before we get to the Rhode Island thing in our next segment for a couple of minutes, how do you think this thing turns out? Does Joe Biden prevail? Yes or no?
I think it's more likely that Biden will prevail than Trump, but it's going to be a long legal battle.
And then we're going to have a transition issue, which is going to be stressful, I think, for the country.
Our world's a reality show.
We'll deal with that 1 minute at a time. When we come back, what we've learned from Rhode Island with PC Professor Joe Cammarano. Stay with us. Welcome back with PC Professor Joe Cammarano. Locally, the race of the century is the Speaker of the House in District 15 in Cranston gets beat handily by Barbara Ann Fenton Fung, the First Lady of Cranston. It already looks like overnight the deal's been made for Joe Shekarchi to end up being the Speaker of the House. He was the majority leader for Speaker Mattiello. So the progressives have not won that battle, but man, they are creeping. That is a demonstrative event in Rhode Island politics. It's going to turn everything upside down. Quick thought on that, Joe?
Yeah, real quick. I think, it's a good sign in part because I do think Mattiello deserves what he's gotten. but also because it's going to lead to the continued evolution toward what we really need in Rhode Island, and that's a two-party system where there are substantial Republicans, not a handful. And so this, I think this will contribute to a more competitive, which also means more transparent and honest government.
Well, it may, I'll tell you, the fact that they haven't gone to work during this COVID crisis is beginning to seep in. We only have a minute here. What was fascinating again was question 1 and the removal of N Providence plantations from the state name. Right up until the last 1/3 of the ballots came in, that question was getting beat handily, but the mail-in ballots took it well over the top, it seems, anyway. How about that for a development? I was surprised about that consciousness of the electorate.
I was surprised last night because I thought it would pass. And when I saw that it was failing, I thought, wow, I guess people just are wedded to tradition. And, that I was blindsided by the lack of disproportionate number of progressives voting early.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it was that close because a lot of folks they made a decision on game day because COVID and all the other distractions really prevented that campaign from actually, cracking through the consciousness. But the conscience of Rhode Island and some organizational strength got that question through, and so we won't be dealing with that anymore. Fascinating. Only have 10 seconds here. Last thought about the rest of the week?
I think the rest of the week we just try to be patient, try to be understanding, and understand that we have a system that goes slow on elections.
Simple as that. All right, Joe, we'll have plenty of conversation to come. Thank you. Final word and we come back. Stay with us. Really most important here, I think, is for us to remain calm, respect each other's positions, and have faith in the integrity of the election process, regardless, and it's strange to say, regardless of what the commander-in-chief has to say about it. You have a great night.